heard the boom, and as soon as I heard the boom, I was on fire. There's no time to react other than get out. The hatch above me was open, thank God, because if it wasn't, I would have never found the lever to get out.
Keep your head up, keep your back straight. Good to go.
Thank you. Good morning. There we go. I like it. All right. So I can tell you that what you saw in that video in the beginning was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I know that's really difficult for people to understand, that that was the best thing that's ever happened to me. And by the end of the talk today that I will have with you, I think you will understand why it was the best thing that ever happened to me. The adversity that I've gone through in life became some of the best things that I've ever dealt with in my life. So hopefully by the end, that's the result. That's what you get. The adversity that you're going to face in your life is going to be some of the best things that's ever happened to you. And right now, that might seem impossible. But in the future, when you look back at it, you can say it. That's the best thing that ever happened to me. So I'm going to take you through my story. I'm going to take you through the longer version of what really awakened that adversity inside of me. And that was over 11 years ago, September 1st, 2006, when I was deployed to Iraq. And I was in the Army, and I was on a patrol on a road that I had been on many times. And it just so happened that that day, somebody had buried an IED under the road. An IED is an improvised explosive device, and it's basically a homemade bomb. My vehicle ran over it. The bomb detonated, went through the bottom of the vehicle, up into the turret where I was sitting, and also in the turret of the vehicle is where we keep our fuel tank. 168 gallons of fuel. It's a diesel-based jet propellant, and as soon as that IED went through the bottom of the vehicle into the turret, it hit that fuel tank. And it covered myself, my two buddies, and the vehicle in fuel, and instantly we were on fire. And that's an actual picture of my vehicle after it had burned. A buddy of mine sent that to me about 8 months after my injury. So as soon as that vehicle was on fire, I was on fire. And I knew right away, first thing I had to do was get out. I had to escape. We'll deal with everything else later. But I have to get out of this vehicle right now. And thankfully that day when I climbed inside of that vehicle, there's a hatch. You climb down from the top of the vehicle, and there's a hatch cover that you have to close when you climb down in. And we're supposed to close that because in case of a chemical attack, there's ever a chemical attack, that hatch is closed and the chemicals can't get in. Well, that morning when I climbed down in, I didn't close that hatch behind me, thankfully. Thankfully, because there was a little tiny lever that I would have had to find above my head, and I would have never found it. In the chaos of everything that was going on, I would have never found that little tiny lever above my head to open that hatch cover. So I was able to just climb out on top. And when I got to the top, then I knew next thing I had to do was get to the ground. And there were two big problems with that. The first one being the fact that it's a long ways to the ground. It's about 13 feet from the very top of the turret of the Bradley to the ground. It's a long drop. And the even bigger problem was I was going to have to do that drop blind because the fire was covering my eyes because my face was on fire. So I just had to jump. I had to take a leap of faith and hope that I would make it to the ground. And I did jump, and I did make it to the ground. But when I landed on the ground, I actually couldn't brace myself for the impact of the landing because I couldn't see the ground. I had no idea where the ground was. So when my feet hit the ground, my leg snapped. The bone snapped, severing an artery in my leg, and 4 days later in the hospital, they ended up amputating my leg, and I have a below-knee amputation and a prosthetic leg now. When I was on the ground, I was still on fire. And what were we all taught to do if we ever caught on fire? Stop, drop, and roll. Some people will say run, and that's a terrible idea. Get down and roll. But I can tell you, it didn't work for me. I rolled. That's what I was taught to do. The only thing I was taught to do was to roll on the ground if I ever caught on fire. And that's what I did. I rolled around, and all I was doing, I was rolling around in dust, and I was setting the dead grass on fire around me. I couldn't put the fire out. So then what do? You did the one thing you were taught to do. What's next? Well, for me, there was no next. Next was giving up. Giving up that thing that Tom talked about, that thing called hope. I gave up hope. Ultimately, I accepted death in that moment. I said, you know what? I'm done. And I'm okay with it because all of my nerves had been burned through, so I didn't feel any pain. I just accepted that that was the day I was going to leave this world. I'd accepted that. I think back now, and it frustrates me that I accepted that I truly did give up that hope that's so important to all of us. But thankfully, for me that day, I only gave up hope for a second because I ended up rolling in one direction. I had no idea which direction I was rolling in. I could have been rolling back to the burning vehicle that was there. I had no idea which direction I was rolling in. And I just happened to be rolling in the direction of a canal. And I fell into the canal, I rolled down into the canal, and the canal had just enough water in it to put the fire out. And eventually a couple of my buddies found me, they heard me yelling. They were all looking for me, but they actually thought I was still in the vehicle and done at that point, but until they heard me yelling. They found me, they came down into the canal, and one of them grabbed underneath my legs. And that was the first pain I had felt because he grabbed my broken leg. And I said, grab up higher. So he grabbed under my knees. And my other buddy grabbed under my arms. And they carried me up to the top of the canal where the helicopters would eventually pick us up. So it's bad enough already with what's gone on. But it's about to get worse. Because when I got to the top of the canal, that's when I knew that if I was going to live, I didn't know if I was going to live or not. I knew that my injuries were bad enough that I may not live. There was a pretty good chance that I probably wouldn't live. But if I did live, then my life was going to be different. I was going to be faced with tons and tons of adversity. And I knew that because I could see how bad my hands were burnt because my palms were basically hanging from my fingertips. I knew how bad my face was burnt because it was basically hanging from my chin. I knew that if I lived, and maybe in that moment I didn't even know if I wanted to live, but if I did live, it was going to be different for me. It was going to be difficult for me. So my buddy who had actually pulled me out, one of my buddies who had actually pulled me out of the canal was standing over me, and he was helping me deal with the situation that I was dealing with. And I asked him a really stupid question. I said, how bad is it? I knew how bad it was, but I asked him, how bad is it? And he said, it's not that bad, as a good friend would in that kind of situation. He lied to me. And I looked back at him after that, and I said, well, I'll never be as ugly as you are. So I figured a little humor in that situation. They all knew that I had a good sense of humor. And seeing that even though I was dealing with a ton of difficult situations right then and there, that my sense of humor was still there, and maybe Rick will be okay. Maybe Rick will get through this. Made the mood a little easier to take for everyone. Brought it down to a manageable level for everyone around me. Unfortunately, that was the only humor that I had inside of me in that moment, because eventually the helicopters got there, took myself and my 2 buddies away to the hospital, and that was unfortunately the last time I ever saw or talked to my really good buddy, Sergeant Luis Montez, ever again. Sergeant Montez was the soldier who was sitting directly next to me inside of the turret of the vehicle, and he ended up passing away 7 days later while we were in the hospital in San Antonio because of the burns that he got that day with me. You know, and with all the stuff that I deal with, the fact that I have these scars and I deal with the prosthetic leg, for sure, that stuff's easy compared to the loss of a friend. But what do I have to do with that? I still have to get through it, and I still have to make his life a positive influence on my life. The things he did for me, those are the things that I concentrate on. I miss him every single day. And I talk about him every single day. I can't think of the last time I have gone a day without mentioning his name. But I think about those positive things and the fact that I probably wouldn't be up here right now if it wasn't for him. If it wasn't for the stuff that he did for me, the leadership role that he had on me. He had a huge influence. He was my leader, and he was actually younger than I was. I was 24 at the time, and he was 22 years old. But he was my leader. It doesn't matter how old you are to be in a leadership role, to have effects on other people. And I'll never forget those things that he did for me, even though he's no longer with us. So I went through some difficult times. Difficult times. I ended up being in the hospital after that for 6 months. For half of a year, I lived in a hospital. I lived in a room with 4 white walls. And at that moment, I was thinking, you know, what's the future? Really, there is no future for me, because those 4 white walls became my future. I didn't know anything different. I had no clue what the rest of my life was going to be. So leadership and adversity. I was handed this leadership role in the military. It was given to me. I said, you are now a leader. Lead these men. I worked up to it, but still, I don't know if I was truly prepared for it. So now, with what's going on in my life, how do I continue to be a leader through this crazy bit of adversity that I'm going to have to deal with? So the definition of adversity is difficulties. It's a 2-part. It's difficulties, and it's also misfortune. I don't know if I truly believe that second part. Maybe in the moment that you're dealing with adversity, there's nothing I can tell you to say, you know what, that's the best thing that's ever going to happen to you. I think it's almost impossible to do that. My buddies weren't standing over me when I was on fire, clapping their hands saying, don't worry, Rick, this is going to be amazing. This is going to be the best thing that ever happened to you. They weren't doing that, because nobody could have ever told me that it was the best thing that ever happened to me. But eventually, I can look back to that and say that. I can look back to that adversity and say it was the best thing that ever happened to me. But now I had to deal with it. I had to figure this out, and I had to fight through it. Like I said, handed this leadership role. This is a picture of me with my mom right after basic training. And I think in the next picture, it even grabs me. I don't see this next picture that often. But now I have to figure this all out like this. Like this. This is the first day that I ever walked on my own. And that's where it began. It's like we think of childhood, where things began. Began at walking. It's starting all over for me. And I had to figure out how. How am I going to be a leader to men around me? Like this. Like this. Nobody had ever seen anything like me before. But before I could figure out the leadership role that I played, what kind of leader I could be, what I could do to be a leader, I had to get hope back. I had to get hope back many times. I needed other leaders in my life to help me get through difficult situations. I needed sweethearts to get me through really difficult situations. Tons of different difficult situations. Hopeless situations where I said in my life, I'm done. Just like when I laid on that ground in Iraq, where I said, you know what, I'm okay with you taking my life right now because I can't live like this. I needed people to give me hope. 4 months into my hospital stay, I hadn't seen my face. I hadn't seen what I looked like. I had no clue how bad I was. So one day I was they got me out of my room. And actually, I didn't see my face, but also my parents and the doctors went as far as blocking the mirrors in my room with old pictures of me and old pictures of my friends and my family so that I wouldn't see my face. And they did that because I knew I was dealing with a lot already. They knew I was dealing with a lot of adversity already. They didn't want to add onto that. They didn't know how much I could handle in that moment. So the day that I went by out into the hallway, they wheeled me out into the hallway, I went right by that mirror and couldn't see my face again. And I was out in the hallway, and I'm being pushed around in my wheelchair, and I'm passed by this Marine who was also burned. He was burned in Afghanistan. And when I saw him, I really couldn't believe what I was looking at. It was almost appalling, and it was so surprising that somebody could live through something like that. But there was no way that I looked as bad as this kid. There was no way, because he's got to be the only one that's ever survived something so horrific. That's how I felt. And in my mind, I was thinking, you know, I'm lucky that I don't look that bad, even though I really didn't know how bad I looked. So eventually, after a few minutes out in the hallway, they took me back to my room. And while I was in Iraq, I actually took a ton of pictures on a digital camera that I bought while I was there. And I transferred them all over to my laptop. And when I was injured, all of my belongings were sent home to my parents. So my laptop was in all my belongings. So my parents had my laptop. And one day when I was laying in the bed, I asked my mom, could you bring me my laptop so that I could see the pictures that I took while I was in Iraq? I just kind of want to reminisce, look at my old buddies, think about the good old days. So she did. She brought me my laptop, and she set it down on my lap. And as soon as she set it down on my lap and she opened up that cover, I finally saw it. For the first time in 4 months, I saw my face, on accident, unintentional, the reflection. I never thought I could become hopeless so quick. I never thought it was possible. But in that moment that I saw my face, I was done. I said, you know what? Really, if I ever do get out of here, who's going to accept me? Who's going to give me a chance? Nobody has ever seen anything like me before. I had never seen anything like me before, except for a couple weeks earlier when I was out in that hallway and I saw that Marine. And I was saying to myself, man, I'm lucky I don't look that bad. Well, I looked just as bad as he did. I told my parents, I told the doctors, leave me alone. Get out of here. I don't want to live. I don't care if I live. I don't care if I die. Don't give me any more medication. Leave me alone, plain and simple. That's where I was, hopeless. So I needed to get right. But I wasn't able to get right on my own. I needed somebody around me to help me get right. I had to have somebody around me give me hope in a hopeless situation. I wasn't finding that hope on my own. It wasn't going to happen. So eventually, they brought in my psychologist. And my psychologist, that's what he's trained to do. He's trained to pull you out of dark spots. He sat down with me, and he was doing everything he was trained to do to pull me out. And nothing he was saying was working. Absolutely nothing. So eventually, he just stops talking about what's going on in my life, and he changed the subject entirely. And he starts talking to me about dead spiders. And in the moment, I'm like, what is this guy doing? He's a trained doctor, and he wants to talk to me about dead spiders. Because when does dead spiders help anyone? I have no idea. But I eventually realized, that's not going to work either. And he realized that what he was doing wasn't working, so he left the room. And at that point, I just figured, he's done. He's done with me. His training did not work. But he was only gone for about a minute, and he came back a minute later, and he has a glass jar full of dead spiders. Full of dead spiders. And at that moment, I think, is when I realized that, you know what? I'm okay. This guy's loony. This guy's nuts. He needs a psychologist. I don't need a psychologist. Honestly, I had no clue what he was doing. I really did not know what he was doing until years later, when I was able to look back at the situation and realize that he took me so far away from the problem that I was dealing with. The problem that I was dealing with, and I was saying, I don't care if I live or I don't care if I die. As soon as he brought those dead spiders into my room, I forgot that I had said that. That's what he was doing. He was giving me hope in a time of hopelessness. In a time of hopelessness. He was giving me a way out of that situation. He saved my life. That's how big it can be when you give hope to people. You can save lives with that hope. One of these sweethearts, that's what sweethearts do. They give hope to others who feel hopeless. And in that moment, that sweetheart saved my life. That's amazing. And I think we should all know, every one of us sitting in here right now, that we have that ability inside of us. We have that hope inside of us. You might believe that a little bit, that you have hope inside of you, but I don't know if you believe it enough to think that you could save lives with it. Hopefully after today you recognize that you, a leader, are the ones that are going to give that hope to other people that are going through some really difficult situations in their lives, and that you could possibly save their life. It's powerful. It doesn't get any more powerful than that. You control other people's lives. So I needed to get through that part. I needed hope many times to get to a point where I'm like, okay, now how do I do this? How do I make myself a leader? And really, there was three things I had to figure out. 3 things along the path that made me realize that this is how I can be a leader while dealing with adversity. 3 little stories that I will share with you. You'll figure it out. Some of the worst advice you'll ever hear in your life. But there's no such thing as bad advice. You take everything, and in that story you'll find out why. Modeling behavior. Somebody's always watching the things that you're doing. Every single situation that you're in, even the most difficult situations that you're in, somebody is watching how you're handling it. And a lot of the times in your life, you're going to have to force yourself to behave differently than you feel. Trust me, I wouldn't be standing in front of you right now if I didn't force myself to behave differently than I felt. I wouldn't be standing in front of you public speaking, because that was one thing I was absolutely terrified of doing in my life. I had to force myself to behave differently. You'll figure it out. A time in my life where things were so uncertain. There was a lot of things that I had to figure out. I was still in the hospital, probably about towards the end of my hospital stay, maybe about 6 months. But it was to the point where I could come out of my room and I could actually go to the cafeteria in the hospital and eat. They didn't have to bring me my food anymore. My mom would take me down in my wheelchair, and she would wheel me into the cafeteria every day. She would wheel me into my table, and then she would leave, and she would go up in line and get my food. So at 25 years old, I had to rely on my mother. Again, it's like starting all over, from walking again to eating again. She went up in the line, she would get my tray and my food, and she would come back and she would sit down with me, and then she would feed me, because I couldn't do it on my own. That was tough for me to swallow, for sure. I went from wrestler, football player, leader of men, and now I'm diminished. I can't even feed myself. I have to rely on my mother. It was difficult. But that one day that I went down into that cafeteria and I sat there at that table while I waited for my mom to come back so that she could feed me, another soldier, he was actually an airman, somebody that was in the Air Force, sat down with me. And he sat across from me. And he was burnt really bad as well. And I looked at his hands, and his hands were worse than mine. And my hands are bad. But his hands were worse than my hands were. So I was waiting for his helper, whoever was with him, to follow right behind him and sit down with him and feed him. Because there was obviously no way this guy could feed himself. No chance of that. So he sits down, and nobody comes. And I'm like, okay. And then he picks up his fork with his hands that don't work at all, and he starts eating. And I'm awestruck. I'm like, how is this possible? So I asked him, really, I need to know, how do you do that? How do you do that? And that's when he gave me the worst advice I've ever heard in my entire life. And he said, you'll figure it out. And really, I was thinking, wow, thanks a lot, buddy. You don't have another minute for me? You can't hang out for a minute and tell me what's going on, how you were able to do that? You'll figure it out. And that was the end of the conversation. I don't think we said one more word to each other the entire time I sat there. And eventually my mom came, sat down with me, picked up my fork, and started feeding me. Again, I didn't feel very good about things at that time. So the worst advice I had ever heard. That's what I got that day. Well, a couple of months later, when I had gotten out of the hospital and I was to a point where I didn't really require somebody else to feed me anymore. I'd graduated on, basically, to a point where I could hold a fork, but I had to have a strap that went around my hand, and the strap had a little slot in it, and the back of the fork would go right into that slot, and then I could eat like that. So I graduated on to that point. Well, I was in Cincinnati, Ohio, and me and a group of friends, probably like 40 of us, went to this steakhouse, this all-you-can-eat steakhouse. Has anybody ever been to a Brazilian steakhouse before? Yeah? To me, that's like heaven. I know, you look at me and you're like, yeah, I get it. That's like heaven to me. I walk into a place that's all-you-can-eat steak, and I actually hear the noise in the background. Oh, that noise. I hear it. That's heaven to me. So I sit down, and I have the plate in front of me, and I'm sitting next to one of my really good buddies. And they start cutting meat off at my table, and I'm in my glory. I don't think so there's a button that you have, and it's green and red. And when it's green, they bring food, and when you turn it to red, they stop. Well, I don't think I knew there was a red side, so I just let them keep bringing that food. So they're bringing this food, and I have my fork in my holder on my hand, this strap, and I put my fork into the first piece of steak on the plate, and the strap falls apart. Done. There's no fixing this strap. So I was in heaven for about 20 minutes, and now all of a sudden I'm in the other side. Heaven is an all-you-can-eat steakhouse. Hell is an all-you-can-eat steakhouse that you can't eat any steak. That's what hell is to me anyways. So I'm like, what am I going to do? And I don't think I was so far past the point where I was like looking at my buddy and thinking, I wonder if he'll feed me. But I was like, all right, let's do this. The worst advice I ever heard in my life, you'll figure it out, became some of the best advice I'd ever heard. I pushed down on the fork, on the prong end, lifted up the back end, put the end of the fork above my thumb, under my hand, and for the first time in almost a year, I picked up a fork without any assisted device, and I put this fork into that meat and I ate the meat. You'll figure it out. In the end, if you want it bad enough, you will figure it out. If it's worth figuring out, you'll figure it out. And for me, an all-you-can-eat steakhouse was the time to figure it out. It's such a terrible example, but it's a perfect story for it. And this is also why I'm overweight. But you'll figure it out. If you want to figure out how to get through adversity bad enough, you'll figure it out. You'll watch people around you. You'll see what other people are doing. You'll figure it out. And in the end, the worst advice that you could ever get sometimes could be the best advice that you've ever gotten. And I took that, you'll figure it out, and I ran with it. Well, I'm still not really good friends with this guy because really, it was terrible advice in the moment. Number 2, modeling behavior. Like I said, when you're doing things, people are watching you all the time. Every second of almost every day, people are watching what you're doing. So one of the things that I did early on, and sometimes I didn't even realize I was doing it. We've all heard the statement, fake it until you make it. Fake it until you make it. A lot of the times I had to put a smile on my face when I didn't want to. So I'm dealing with some very difficult things in my life, and I have to smile. Now, it's important to do that, but I think the most important part about putting that smile on your face is watching people around you, how they're reacting to that smile. Because if you're just smiling and you're not getting anything back from that, that's dangerous territory. That's dangerous. You're not helping yourself. You might be helping others, but you're not realizing it. You have to realize that that smile that you're putting on your face is helping other people. You have to model that, even through the most difficult times. So I was smiling a lot of the time, and I was faking it. But I was making other people around me happy. And people were saying to me, man, Rick, you're so happy. You're so inspiring that you can smile through it all. And that's where the reward came. They saw that I was dealing with some really difficult things in my life, and that I was still smiling through it all. And the reward came when they said those things. That, man, I'm watching you, and now I think that, you know what, if I can see you get through something like that with a smile, maybe I can as well. Modeling that. But that took a long time for me to realize that I was even doing that. And it was actually when I read a book, when I actually realized that I was modeling that. How many of you had read the last lecture? Oh, that's not enough hands in this group. Please, if you want to be inspired, if you want to know how to get through some adversity in life, please read the last lecture. It's an amazing book. Randy Posh is the author. So I was reading that book. This is about 1.5 years after my injury, and I had been smiling for a long time and not really knowing if it's real or not. I didn't know. I picked up this book, and I read it. And I got to maybe 3/4 of the way through it. I can't remember what part of the book it was in. But I read this one line, and I thought to myself, and the line was, so little background on Randy. Randy was stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He was dying. And he wasn't coming back from it. And he knew that he wasn't coming back from it. And one day, he was driving in his car, and he was stopped at a red light. And a car came up behind him, and there was a lady in it. And the lady was watching this guy. It was a convertible. He was in a convertible. And she's watching him, and she sees this guy like smiling and laughing and singing by himself. There's nobody else in the car. And she pulls up closer, and she sees that it's Randy. And she worked with him. So she goes back and she emails him and she tells him, I saw you today at the red light, and I saw the pure joy and happiness and that smile that you had on your face. Even though you're dealing with so much in your life, you know you're going to die. And you're still smiling through it all. And he said that email was when he realized that, you know what? I'm not just smiling for everyone else. I'm smiling because I'm truly happy. And when I read that line, that's when I realized that, you know what? I faked it long enough. I faked that smile long enough where now I'm good. I am truly happy. When I read that line, I was like, holy cow. I don't even know if I read past that point in the book. That was what I needed from that book. Eventually, I listened to it on tape. But I think that part of the book, I stopped reading. I got what I needed. I realized that I was truly happy with my life. I faked it long enough to deal with that. So right after I had read that, I wrote an email to Randy. Randy only had a couple months to live. I never expected him to write back, and I even wrote that in there. I told him, you know, I don't expect you to write back to me. I know that he's got millions of people writing to him about the book that he wrote. And I wrote to him, and a couple of days or weeks after I wrote to him, he wrote back to me. And it's an email I'll have forever. And it was one of the most happiest moments in my life to get this one-line response from Randy. And all it said was, if you can't, I am honored by your compliments, and I greatly thank you for your service. That's all. It was so simple, but it made my day. It made my week. It made my life better just from that little response that he gave me. I had I read about his adversity. I had learned some things through him. Obviously, his book was meant for people to see. But again, the things that we're doing almost all the time, people are watching. We're an open book to people around us. Somebody's always watching. When I was doing my recovery in my rehab facility, it was all military men. You saw in the video me walking through those guys with prosthetic legs and injuries that were some beyond belief. Those are the guys that I was surrounded with every day. And I didn't really talk to them when I first went in, but I went in every day. I went to my machine that I would work on, and I would get strapped to the machine because I couldn't hold the hand grips, so they would strap my hands to it. I didn't have my leg at the time. I was still in a wheelchair, so they would strap my foot to the foot pedal, and I would do that for hours. And I would just go in and I would do my thing, and I would do the right thing. And one day, this guy came over to me, and this guy was injured also. He was missing both of his legs and an arm. So I couldn't believe that there were injuries that bad even. But then the next thing he said to me surprised me. He said, "You've been inspiring me since day one." And I couldn't believe that because I had been watching him this entire time, and he was my inspiration. In my mind, his injuries were way worse than mine were. But that's not the way he saw it. He saw it as, you know what, he's dealing with some difficult things, really difficult things in his life, and he's doing this every single day. And that's the idea. Somebody is always watching you. Are you doing the right thing? Are you setting the right example? Are you modeling the right behavior? That time I was. And I was inspiring the people around me by not even knowing that I was doing it. Because again, people are watching you every second. And are you making those right decisions? I had to force myself to behave differently than I felt at times as well. Some really awful choices that I had to make in my life. Times where I was like, you know what, there's no way through this situation. Last year, 2 years ago, every year I deal with an issue with my prosthetic leg, and I end up in my wheelchair. And it is a time that I dread because just after a year of wearing it and with our schedule, my leg breaks down. And eventually I have to end up in my wheelchair. And I can't stand being in my wheelchair. It's hard for me to get around. I have to load it into a vehicle, and it's not easy. I have to go to the back of the vehicle. I have to, with one leg, lift up my wheelchair, throw it in the back of my vehicle, and then hop around to the front. And then when I get there, especially living where we live, there's a lot of snow on the ground. Doing that in the snow is not easy. So 2 years ago, right around Thanksgiving, my leg broke down again, and I had to take it off. I went 6 months with this wound on my leg. And finally, I was like, okay, this is bad. It got so bad, I should have been off my leg 6 months earlier. I went to the doctor, and they said, you have to take your leg off. There's a chance that that gets infected, and we have to amputate again. So I was like, okay. I took my leg off. But I had a speaking engagement in a couple of days. And I had never really done one. The first one I ever did was in a wheelchair. But I hadn't done one in a long time in a wheelchair, and I wasn't comfortable. And it was at a tough school, a very tough school in Binghamton. So I canceled it. I canceled my presentation because I wasn't comfortable giving that presentation. I was done. I called her up and I said, listen, I know the presentation's on Monday. It's Friday right now, but I can't do it. I'm in my wheelchair. I made it okay. She understood, but it doesn't matter. We have excuses for things. People say to me all the time, you know, we understand why you don't work out. We understand why your health isn't the best because of what you're dealing with. I don't care what that is. That's called an excuse. And we all can make them. And that's what I did that day. Could I have done that speech? Absolutely. But I found an excuse that somebody would accept, that I forced myself to even accept. Oh, I can't do that. I'm in my wheelchair. It's going to be really hard for me to get around. I don't know what the stage looks like. I convinced myself that, you know what? This is a real reason that I can't do this. I regret it. Big time. Because when you don't force yourself to behave differently than you feel sometimes, other people around you are losing out. And when other people are losing out because of a choice that you made, scratch leader off your list. That's not a leader. Man, I had to figure that one out. I will never cancel a speech again. Last year, an entire month of the year with Tom, I went on speeches, I went and did presentations in my wheelchair every single day. Can I do it? Absolutely. Can you do difficult things? Absolutely. Are you going to make the choice to do those difficult things? I don't know. But that's what's going to separate you from everybody else. That's the defining thing for you. Are you going to force yourself to behave differently than you feel? And I won't let others lose out on opportunities because of a choice that I'm making. No matter the adversity, don't lose sight of the opportunity. You've heard that word so many times today, to model leadership. Adversity. We say the definition was difficulties and misfortune. Well, again, that second word is a load of crap. In the moment, I get it. It's an unfortunate situation that you're dealing with. But in the end, let's get rid of that and say, you know what? I'm fortunate. The adversity that I've dealt with in my life is what has made me as good as I am. The best that I can be. I welcome it. Bring it on. It's a learning opportunity for all of us. And in the end, after everything that I've talked about, after the adversity that I've dealt with, I can truly tell you that my hands still don't work very well. I'm happier than I've ever been in my entire life. And it's because of the things that I've dealt with. We talk about hold on, possibilities exist. And this wasn't even a part of today's presentation, but it's something I think is important to add. So when I was in that hospital and I saw my face for the first time, and I said, who is going to accept me when I get out of here? Who is going to give me a chance? I didn't believe that was ever going to happen. And that was in a lot of aspects of life. But the biggest of them all was, am I ever going to have a relationship with somebody ever again? What female is going to take me in and decide, you know what? I want to wake up with him forever. Hold on, possibilities exist. I got married this summer. So I wasn't going to add that part in, but I feel it's so important. And since that's the first time I've ever said it, I almost cried up here. That's really horrible. Thankfully, it didn't actually happen, but now it doesn't matter because I told you I was going to do it. Sometimes I'm still learning things. I shouldn't say things sometimes. But in the end, the adversity that you've dealt with in your life leads to that. Happiness. Being happier than you've ever been in your entire life. Look at that misfortune as being fortunate. Thank you all very much. Awesome leadership.